After the interlude of Numbers chapters 18 and 19 that sought to make the point that the priesthood of the Lord established, was permanent and it was needed, and after the ordaining and reissuing in more detail of some instructions regarding holiness and purification and the terribly serious nature of impurity caused by death, chapter 20 now picks up again with the actual journey of the Israelites towards their promised land. Now, what we are about to read takes place about 40 years after the Israelites fled Egypt. So their time of wandering is about to come to a close. Open your Bibles to Numbers chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20, page 172, if you have a complete Jewish Bible. Numbers chapter 20. The people of Israel, the whole community, entered the Sin desert in the first month, and they stayed in Kadesh. There Miriam died, and there she was buried. Because the community had no water, they assembled themselves against Moshe and Aharon. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, "We wish we died when our brothers died before Adonai. Why did you bring Adonai's community into the desert to die there, we and our livestock? Why did you make us leave Egypt? To bring us to this terrible place without seed, figs, grapevines, pomegranates, even water to drink." And Moses and Aaron left the assembly and went to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces. And the glory of Adonai appeared to them. And Adonai said to Moses, "Take the staff and assemble the community, you and Aaron your brother, and before their eyes tell the rock to produce its water. You will bring them water out of a rock, and thus enable the community and their livestock to drink." Moses took the staff from the presence of Adonai as he had ordered him. But after Moses and Aaron had assembled the community in front of the rock, he said to them, "Listen here, you rebels. Are we supposed to bring you water from this rock?" Then Moses raised his hand and he hit the rock twice with his staff. Water flowed out in abundance. The community and their livestock drank. But as Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me, so as to cause me to be regarded as holy by the people of Israel, you will not bring this community into the land I have given to them." This is Meribah spring, where the people of Israel disputed with Adonai, and he caused them to be regarded as holy, by them. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. "This is what your brother Israel says. You know all the troubles we've gone through, that our ancestors went down into Egypt. We lived in Egypt for a long time, and the Egyptians treated us and our ancestors badly. But when we cried out to Adonai, he heard us. He sent an angel and brought us out of Egypt, and now we are in Kadesh, a city at the edge of your territory. Please, let us pass through your land. We'll not go through fields or vineyards. We won't drink any water from the wells. We will go along the king's highway, not turning aside either to the right or to the left until we've left your territory." But Edom answered, "You're not to pass through my land, and if you do, I'll come out against you with the sword." And the people of Israel replied, "We will keep to the highway. If we do drink the water, either we or our livestock will pay for it. Just let us pass through on foot. It's nothing." But he said, "You're not to pass through." And Edom came out against them with many people and much force. Thus Edom refused to allow Israel passage through its territory, so Israel turned away. They traveled on from Kadesh, and the people of Israel, the whole community, arrived at Mount Hor. At Mount Hor, by the border of the land of Edom, Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, "Aaron is about to be gathered to his people, because he is not to enter the land I have given to the people of Israel, inasmuch as you rebelled against what I said at Meribah spring. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son and bring them up to Mount Hor. Remove the garments from Aaron and put them on Eleazar his son. Aaron will be gathered to his people. He will die there." Moses did as Adonai had ordered. They went up onto Mount Hor before the eyes of the whole community, and Moses removed the garments from Aaron and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down the mountain, and when the whole community saw that Aaron was dead, They mourned Aaron 30 days, the whole house of Israel. Israel arrives at the southernmost border of the region of Canaan. And as they close in on their destination, this place is called Kadesh. And it's usually considered to be one and the same as Kadesh Barnea. This was a desert region. And we're told that this place was considered to be in the wilderness of Zin. And where the wilderness of Paran leaves off, the wilderness of Zin begins. So Israel was more or less at the boundary between a couple of areas. Now, with virtually no comment and zero emotion, we're told that Miriam, sister to Moses and Aaron, dies and is buried there. Hebrew literature, particularly the Bible, is so different in many respects from other literature of its day, of its era. When we read of Egyptian or Hittite or Arabian or later Greek and Roman historical accounts, they dwell on the circumstances regarding death and battle. Just like our modern day Hollywood films that tend to focus on conflict and carnage because people are attracted to it more than character development or the establishment of principles. And it's been so since time immemorial. But here we have a great example of how the Bible deals with these matters. Perhaps the central figure of the Old Testament, Miriam, if we discount Eve as a special category. She dies, and it's listed as not much more than a minor accounting record. Now we could say in a knee-jerk reaction it's because she was a woman in a male-dominated society, so she didn't have much value. But we don't get significantly more verbiage when we come to the deaths of Moses and Aaron, or most other primary male biblical figures. So gender's not the issue. It's truly fascinating, maybe ironic, maybe both, that the focal female personage of both the Old and the New Testaments is a woman named Miriam, Mary. Because the mother of Jesus, who Christianity tends to call Mary, was a Jew. But Miriam isn't a Jewish name. Mary isn't a Jewish name, rather. Her name was Miriam, Hebrew name. And as we've often seen in the journey of the Israelites, once again they're in need of water. And once again they go to Moses and they want to know what he's going to do about it. And once again they openly express their distress at being led out into a barren place when what they longed for lay behind them in Egypt. Back in Egypt, they say, they had plenty of food. Figs, grapes, pomegranates, and more pertinent to the story, plenty of water. Living along the Nile meant you never thirsted for water. Now, not knowing what else to do, Aaron and Moses go to the wilderness tabernacle and they fall on their faces in worship and they seek the counsel of the Lord. And Jehovah appears to them and he speaks to them. And the gist of the conversation is that Aaron is to take his rod, his staff, that one that budded, walk over to some conspicuous rock formation that was nearby, and they were to assemble the whole community of Israel as witness to what was about to happen, and then Moses was to speak, or better, to order that rock to give up water. Moses did as he was told. He took the rod, he went to the rock, and then proceeded to speak harshly to the people. And basically he says, you always come griping to me. You expect me to handle everything for you. Somehow or another, even in a place where there's no water, I'm supposed to just manufacture it for you and fix these problems as though I made them in the first place. Then he turns and he whacks that rock with Aaron's staff twice, and out flowed apparently enormous volumes of water. Because for 3 million people and all those animals to survive, the U.S. Army quartermaster estimates it would take something on the order of 11 million gallons of water every day. Well, the people were happy enough at this event Turns out the Lord didn't feel the same way about it, though. He tells Moses and Aaron, because they didn't affirm God's sanctity in front of the Israelite community, neither of them are going to enter the promised land. We have no record of a response or reaction from Moses or Aaron, but I think we can only imagine their shock and their depression at this immovable edict of God. And anyone studying this might want to ask himself, why? Why such a harsh decree from the Lord to the very two men he has used and to some degree used up to achieve his purposes of rescuing Israel? What is it that Moses and Aaron did that would bring this sort of wrath of God upon him? The obvious is that Moses disobeyed God. He hit the rock that he was only supposed to verbally order to produce water. But this seems a very small thing in comparison to the consequences he faced. And in truth, there's been a lot of theories produced to explain this devastating retribution upon Moses and Aaron. And among those theories are these: that in striking the rock, he struck it twice instead of once. Also, that his character flaws were displayed. A blazing temper caused Moses to care very little for the real need of the people, for water. And so he saw the matter as mostly just a big bother to him. And another is that he doubted God. And thus God told him exactly that, because you did not trust in me, you're going to be punished. And of course, the most popular is that he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, as he was ordered by God. Now, I think that the matter primarily comes down to an attitude that Moses displayed in front of Israel, in which he unintentionally validated a pagan belief held by most people of that era. And in doing so, failed to show God as the one who brings forth the water, not a man. And we must remember that Israel's only a few months, a few years removed from Egypt, relative amount of time. They behaved a lot more Egyptian than they did Hebrew. And deep-seated in their belief system was the acceptance of magic, of sorcerers, men who possessed special power that was loaned to them by gods. So sorcerers invariably made a big show of using incantations, all accompanied by wild gestures when they did their magic. And naturally, these magicians were feared and revered because they seemed to possess a lot of power. Well, Moses and Aaron took credit for the water coming forth out of the rock. In fact, the way they behaved implied it was by their power that this amazing thing happened. Verse 10 says, "Listen here, you rebels, we," Aaron and Moses, "are we supposed to bring you water from this rock?" So Moses struck the rock and the water came out. Now, some of the great Hebrew sages say that the great sin resulted from Moses saying, "Notzi," meaning, "shall we draw forth," when what he should have said is, "Yotzi," shall he draw forth. By saying Notzi, Moses was giving credit to he and Aaron as though they had the power of sorcerers to call forth water from a rock, instead of directing all honor and glory to Jehovah, who's the one with the power. The result of this rash public indiscretion is that it reflected badly on God. So the Lord says in verse 12, "But Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me, so as to cause me to be regarded as holy by the people of Israel." The water being miraculously provided for the people from just an inert rock should have been an opportunity for God to have his mercy on display, his love, his unlimited ability to care for his own. The sanctity that should have been accorded to him became muddled in the minds of those who could have benefited greatly from the lesson that among the Hebrews there is no sorcery and there will be no sorcerers. The word used in verse 12 as holy, or depending on your Bible version, sanctified, is Kadash. In other words, God says that he was not Kadash as he should have been by the provision of the water. And from the root of the word Kadash comes Kadosh and Kodesh and other forms that all center on this very difficult concept of holiness. And as I told you in an earlier lesson, in reality, the root word Kadash is generic in its meaning, and it only applies to the divine if it's used in a divine context. Kadash generally means to just set apart or make separate, to make a distinction. So I gave the example of my wife separating dark loads from light loads when doing laundry, and that the Hebrew word Kadash would have been appropriate to describe her act of separating the colors of clothing before putting them in the washing machine. God wanted to show that he stood alone. He stood distinct, apart from any being, but instead, Moses and Aaron attempted to show themselves as being distinct and apart from Israel. They showed themselves as inherently possessing many of the powers of God. And since God was denied his due in the miracle of the water from the rock, Moses and Aaron would be denied their due and not allowed to enter the promised land. Because verse 12 says, "You will not bring this community into the land I've given to them." I mean, this is really a big warning, especially to those who hold themselves up as God's representative and leaders. How many pastors and teachers and prophets claim a power and an ability of our own to be used at our own discretion, when in fact we have no inherent power at all? We have none. Or there's a claim of personal credit for acts of God. Some time ago, not all that long ago, I was channel checking, and I heard a TV pastor who was trolling for funds for his ministry say that if people would send him $1,000, he would covenant with them and vow a threefold return in their investment in his ministry. I see a couple of shaking heads who heard the same thing. He was proudly saying he had the spiritual power to cause God to miraculously give you back $3,000 if you sent $1,000 to support his ministry. What a deal. I mean, you can really get rich doing this. Well, I want to be clear on this. Moses' penalty for displaying that kind of haughty attitude and for misleading people into thinking that something that is simply not true like that is that he would never allowed to enter into the promised land. And I don't think that guy was greater than Moses, as was usually the case in that era. The place where all this happened was named according to what happened there. So the place became known as the waters of Meribah. Meribah means quarreling. And it's fascinating that despite Moses and Aaron's high-handed sin against the Lord, and despite the quarreling of the people aimed at the Lord, in the end, he still used all this to affirm his Kadesh, his sanctity, his holiness. It would seem that the object of the people's anger and frustration was Moses. But as we keep being reminded, whatever issues that we might have with God's mediator is no different than having that issue with God. How we respond to God's mediator is the same as responding to God himself. Can't be separated. Suddenly in verse 14, the scene shifts. The first time Israel was attempting to enter Canaan 38 years earlier, it was from the south. In fact, it wasn't far from this very place that they were at now, Kadesh. So Moses decides on a different approach. He'll try to enter it from the east. There's a problem. The most direct route to the place where Moses wants to cross into Canaan, over the Jordan River, requires going through the territory of Edom. And etiquette and good statesmanship required that emissaries, representatives of Israel, was sent to the king of Edom to ask his permission to pass through the land of Edom. So Moses sends a messenger to whoever was the current king. Please allow us to pass through. After all, we are your brothers. See, that statement, we are your brothers, that was no self-serving flattery. Nor was Moses calling Edom brother a figure of speech. It wasn't a Middle Eastern display of friendship. Israel was Edom's brother. Jacob is Israel's alternate name. Jacob's twin brother, Esau, is Edom. See, this wasn't symbolism. Edom is just another name for Esau, just like Israel's another name for Jacob. So even though the last time the Bible spoke of some dealings between a repentant Jacob who was returning home from Canaan to Canaan from Mesopotamia, and a forgiving twin brother Esau, who had his birthright stolen by Jacob, at least in his eyes, attitudes had obviously changed over the last 5 centuries or so, at least as far as Esau's descendants were concerned. Now, interestingly, all evidence and some pretty reliable Egyptian records indicates that Edom, at the time of the Exodus, didn't have any walled cities in their territory. They even had but a few permanent villages because the people of Edom were nomadic, very much Bedouin-like in that era. Yet it is obvious from these same records that they were a formidable people. And they didn't seem to have any problem mounting a sizable militia for their defense. And that's what we see happening here. And despite Moses' plea to the king of Edom to remember their common blood heritage, we're brothers, and a promise of peace and respect, the king denies them entry into his region. Moses promises he will not take any path except the king's highway. He won't even take any water from Edom's wells. In fact, they'll hurry across the territory. And the king's answer remains swift and sure. No! And he says, if you try, we'll attack you. And in order that Moses understands this isn't an idle threat, the king sends a large contingent of men to block their path. Moses got the message. Israel turned away from Edom and headed towards a place called Mount Hor that was on the edge of Edom, but it wasn't in Edom. Now, exactly where Mount Hor was located is disputed. First of all, Mount Hor is obviously a generic name because Hor is a derivative of the Hebrew root word har, which means mountain. So if we take the term literally, they went to a place called Mount Mountain. And likely, this just indicates that wherever they went, the most prominent feature was a sizable mountain. And moving along quickly, the scriptures now tell us that the Lord decides that Aaron's days are completed, and at Mount Hor he will die. And as is the custom of this era, the words telling of Aaron's pending death are, Aaron will be gathered to his kin. And as we've discussed on a number of occasions, but I think the point can't ever be made often enough, this gathered to his kin concept was an ancestor worship related phrase. And while we today might say of a departed believer, he died and went to be with the Lord, no such thought even remotely existed to the Israelites, neither of the Exodus nor of much later times. Rather, the thought and hope was that some mysterious life essence of that person would live on with their ancestors, certainly not with God. Why is that important for us to grasp? because the Hebrews were always living on the edge of idolatry. And they had a difficult time divesting themselves of centuries of pagan beliefs that they lived under and they were surrounded with. And the concepts that the average Christian holds today about death and dying and a whole laundry list of other principles weren't yet developed among these ancient Israelites. The laws and the commandments they received from God, they took in the life context of their current beliefs, of their current living situation. Generally, they only added it to their lives in small doses, one form or another, just like we tend to do in modern times. And their beliefs in the days of Moses generally matched those things that were practiced in Egypt. Now, I want to give you an example of what I'm getting at when I speak of life context that I hope will make an impact, not just in helping us to identify with those biblical Hebrews, and in helping us to think in terms that they thought in as we read of them in our Bibles, but also as we deal with our modern day Christian brothers and sisters who live outside of the United States in cultures that are total odds with our own. American believers in particular tend to think that our views and doctrines and traditions are superior, and that they are the views and doctrines and traditions, and pretty much everything else is error or it's improper. For example, what I think I can widely call the American church is very prosperity oriented. Very prosperity oriented. In general, our doctrine in this regard can be summed up by saying that prosperity is not only a hope for, but in many cases, expected blessing from the Lord as a reward for our belief and trust in Him. And that if we do not have material prosperity, it's sometimes seen among our brothers and sisters as an outward sign of our personal lack of faith, or that we don't have enough commitment to our local congregation or to Him. In other words, in America, we expect prosperity blessings to include, or even be centered upon, material wealth. Nice cars, big houses, designer clothes, high-paying jobs, all this. These are all the indicators, at least partially, of our standing with God. So if you don't have much prosperity, you must have little faith, and therefore little standing with God. That's not that way throughout, but it's pretty prevalent. Now, while the Eastern and the European churches also have their own version of a prosperity doctrine, theirs is different than ours. Theirs is about health and peace and children and well-being. In fact, the European and Eastern churches, I think we could generally say, are anti-material prosperity. They see the possession of personal material prosperity as crude, as pagan, against the teachings of Christ. A Christian who's done too well financially is generally looked down upon, and their faith is suspect. To pray for material prosperity is unthinkable for them. It'd be the height of apostasy in their point of view. Why these enormous differences between the American church view of the place of prosperity in our doctrines versus most other churches in other nations on this planet? Different life contexts. Our American society is a wealth-oriented society from top to bottom. From just a secular viewpoint alone, Americans who don't have the things we desire are seen as underprivileged and downtrodden. Our goal is generally to always strive for more So we have expectations about our lives that tomorrow we'll have more than we have today, and today we should have more than we had yesterday. And as Christians, we have a helper in God to see to it that we achieve that material prosperity that's so important to us. That is the American life context. In Europe and in Eastern societies who are more socialist in their thinking, less is more. In fact, to the European Christian, less is more godly. Equality is not an equal opportunity to advance. Equality means literally everybody lives in the same condition. A doctor should be paid the same as a custodian. A coal miner should have the same sized apartment as a company CEO. There should be no rich or poor. If I have plenty of food, so should you. My prosperity, by definition, takes away from yours. Because under socialism, the economy is a zero-sum game. There's a finite amount of resources to go around. So the goal is equal sufficiency for all. That's their life context. Now, obviously I'm generalizing because nothing's quite that nice, neat, and clean. So which doctrine of prosperity is right? The American one or the Eastern and European one? We're not going to debate that today. The point is, our American Christian viewpoint and their Eastern Christian viewpoints about prosperity were adapted to the realities of their respected societies, not the other way around. So whatever God told these ancient Hebrews, they took it in the life context of their long-held beliefs, not as a complete replacement for their old beliefs. They didn't somehow just remove centuries of ideas and traditions and customs from their minds about what seemed to be self-evident about life and the world of the gods. They just added what they were given by Moses at Mount Sinai to the mix. So it was automatic that since Aaron was a good man, that when he died, naturally his life essence would, as a reward, go on to live with his departed family members, his deceased ancestral kin. And as Israel was on the verge of entering the promised land, and as Aaron and Moses were to be excluded due to their high-handed sin of striking the rock, it was time for Aaron to be replaced. Further, the Lord ordered that Aaron was to strip, literally, of his high priest garments, and they were to be turned over to his son Eleazar, who would assume the position as the new high priest, the replacement of Aaron, his father. Moses did as he was told. He led Eleazar and Aaron to the summit of Mount Hor, and verse 27 makes the point that the entire congregation of Israel witnessed this whole event. And up on the mountain, Aaron died, and Eleazar became the new high priest. I want you to notice a couple of things. First, as with the death of Miriam, the death of Aaron is just a matter of fact. There's no grand eulogy. There's no recounting of his great sacrifice and service to the Lord and to the people of Israel. This is the standard biblical treatment of the passing of all the great Bible personalities. Second point, Aaron was a fortunate man. He lived to know that his son would succeed him as high priest. But as we're soon going to find out, Moses received no honor like that. A son succeeding his father was a cherished tradition that all fathers hoped for. A father passing his business or his mantle of leadership on to his son to succeed him still means something to us in our era. But it was everything in the ancient times. That Moses' sons did not become the new God-appointed leaders of Israel must have been pretty disappointing to Moses. When Moses and Eleazar came back down the mountain without Aaron, the nation of Israel knows that Aaron's gone. And so The whole of Israel mourns for 30 days. Why did Moses and others ascend a mountain for this event? Well, as you probably noticed, great spiritual ventures in the Old Testament take place on mountaintops. That's where it happens. And I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that it is now believed that El Shaddai means God of the mountain. And for God to call Moses and Aaron and Eleazar to come up to the mountaintop indicated a momentous spiritual event was about to occur in the presence of God. Yet God was not dwelling on a mountaintop right now. The wilderness tabernacle was his earthly abode. Why didn't God call them to the tabernacle? It was a good place for Aaron to die. There was no way that Aaron could die in the tabernacle, or he would have defiled God's holiness. So it had to be on a mountaintop, a high place that in Hebrew is called Bama, and that this important changing of the guard, if you would, takes place. Let's read some more of Numbers. We're going to read chapter 21, page 173 of your complete Jewish Bible. Numbers 21. Then the king of Arad, a Canaanite who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was approaching by way of Atarim. So he attacked Israel and took some of them captive. Israel made a vow to Adonai, "If you will hand this people over to me, I will completely destroy their cities." Adonai listened to what Israel said and handed over the Canaanites, so that they completely destroyed them and their cities and named the place Hormah. Then they traveled from Mount Hor on the road towards the Sea of Suf in order to go around the land of Edom, but the people's tempers grew short because of the detour. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? There's no real food. There's no water, and we're sick of this miserable stuff we've been eating." In response, Adonai sent poisonous snakes among the people, and they bit the people, and many of Israel's people died. And the people came to Moses and said, "Oh, we sinned by speaking against Adonai and against you. Pray to Adonai that he rids us of these snakes." And Moses prayed for the people, and Adonai answered Moses, "Make a poisonous snake and put it on a pole. And when anyone who's been bitten sees it, he will live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on the pole. If a snake had bitten someone, then when he looked towards the bronze snake, he stayed alive. And the people of Israel traveled on and camped at Ovot. And from Ovot, they traveled and camped at Ei Havarim, in the desert fronting Moab on the east. And from there they traveled and camped in Wadi Sered. And from there they traveled and camped on the other side of the Arnon in the desert. This river comes out of the territory of the Amorites. For the Arnon is the boundary between Moab and the Amorites. This is why it says in the book of the wars of Adonai, "Vahev at Sufa, the wadis of Arnon, and the slope of the walls of the wadis extending as far as the site of Ar, which lies next to the territory of Moab." From there they went on to Beer, which means well. This is the well about which Adonai said to Moses, "Assemble the people, and I'll give them water." Then Israel sang this song, "Spring up, O well, sing to the well sunk by the princes, dug by the people's leaders with the scepter, with their staffs." From the desert they went to Mattanah, and from Mattanah to Nachaliel, from Nachaliel to Bamot, and from Bamot to the valley by the plain of Moab at the start of the Pisgah range, where it overlooks the desert. Israel sent messenger to Sihon, king of the Amorites, with this message: "Let me pass through your land. We won't turn aside into the fields or the vineyards. We won't drink any water from the wells. We will go along the king's highway until we've left your territory." But Sihon would not allow Israel to pass through his territory. Instead, Sihon mustered all of his people, and he went out into the desert to fight Israel. And on reaching Yachatz, he fought Israel. And Israel defeated him by force of arms and took control of his land from the Arnon to the Yabok River, but only as far as the people of Ammon, because the territory of the people of Ammon was well defended. Israel took all these cities. Israel lived in all the cities of the Amorites, and Heshbon, all its surrounding towns. Heshbon was the city of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab and conquered all his land up to the Arnon. This is why the storytellers say, "Come to Heshbon, let it be rebuilt, let Sihon's city be restored. For fire burst out of Heshbon, a flame from the city of Sichon. It consumed Ar of Moab and the lords of Arnon's high places. Woe to you, Moab! You are destroyed, people of Chemosh. He let his sons be fugitives and his daughters captives of Sichon, king of the Amorites. We shot them down. Heshbon is destroyed all the way to Dibon. We even laid waste to Nophach, which extends as far as Medeba. Then Israel lived in the land of the Amorites. Moses sent men to reconnoiter Yatzer. They captured its towns and drove out the Amorites who were there. Then they turned. They went up along the road to Bashan. And Og, the king of Bashan, marched out against them, he with all his people, to fight at Edrei. And Adonai said to Moses, don't be afraid of him, for I have handed him over to you with all his people and his land. You will treat him just as you did Sichon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. So they struck him down with his sons and all his people, till there was no one left alive, and then they took control of his land. The 30-day period of mourning Aaron is now over. And so the Israelites are once again on the move, but they don't get very far. There is simply no way you hide the movement of 3 million people. The word's out. All the indigenous people of Canaan and the surrounding nations are watching Israel like hawks. Every one of these nations would have sent out scouts to see just where these Israelites were going. I mean, Israel's intentions to move into Canaan, this was no secret. It was simply a matter of the route. What was going to be the strategy of their conquest? An unnamed Canaanite king, the king of an area called Arad, isn't waiting for Israel to move upon him, so he makes a preemptive strike. Arad is a region located in the Negev. The capital city of Arad is on the western side of the hills that separate the giant rift valley called the Arabah from the coastal plains of the Mediterranean. At first, Arad's forces gain the upper hand. They take some Hebrews prisoners. The Israelites aren't battle-tested yet, so they probably didn't fight very well. But this is going to be a turning point. In proper response to their trouble, the whole community turns to God and they make a vow that if he'll lead them to victory, they will offer to him all the captured booty that they take from the enemy. Look at verses 2 and 3. Most translations say that if the Lord will hand the Canaanite people over to them, they will destroy the enemy's cities. Next it says that the Lord accepted their vow. He delivered up the Canaanites, and so their cities were destroyed, and therefore the place was named Hormah, which means destructions. Actually, the vow was not that Israel would necessarily destroy cities. Rather, it was they would put them under the ban. The Hebrew word is herem. And what this is indicating is a rather significant act of self-denial. And the self-denial was that there would be a ban placed on the town such that the Israelites couldn't loot them for themselves. The Israelite army was a militia. Each man armed himself. Each man supplied his own food. Therefore, whenever an enemy town was taken, typically the victorious soldiers looted it. And whatever each man could take for himself was his reward, kind of his pay for his service, for the risks he took. But what the Israelites did was to offer God all the booty of the towns that they took in exchange for his supernatural assurance of victory. And by the way, the Israelites did destroy the towns in the process, but the vow was not to destroy the towns. It was to give everything of value that was captured to the Lord in order to have his favor. The destruction of the towns was part of the process of taking the towns, and at times partly the way of offering up the towns as a sort of burnt offering to God. Now the next verse, verse 4, tells us something kind of interesting. We have to look at a map to understand it. At this time, Israel was right on the border of the land of Canaan. And recalling that their request to the king of Recall that the request of the king of Edom to pass through his land fell on deaf ears. In fact, the king sent out some troops to stand in their way. In the end, each side just went their own way. Next, we have Aaron being escorted up to a mountaintop. He died there. His son took over the position as high priest. Then we have this king of Arad come and make a preemptive strike on Israel. And this all happened in a period of a little more than a month, within a very small area, just a handful of miles in either direction, not more than 20 miles to the south and west of the Dead Sea. But verse 4 says that now they turned to go by way of the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea, in order to avoid going through Edom. Why, after this victory over Arad, did they not just go straight north, go right on into the land? Why did they just not ignore Edom's threat, especially now that Israel was flush with confidence after their recent battle victory, and just take the route they had originally intended, through Edom up to the Jordan River? Well, it's fairly well documented that going straight north would have run Israel headlong into an enemy that seemed undefeatable, a people known then as the Sea Peoples, who would eventually come to be called the Philistines. Apparently, very early into the journey, it was decided that they would not take that route. Recall the statement from back in Exodus 13, verse 17, concerning the route that God refused to take the Israelites on to the promised land. There it says, "Now it came about when Pharaoh let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines," by the way of the land of the Sea Peoples, "even though it was near. Because God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war, and they return to Egypt." God didn't want Israel to go up against the Sea Peoples, the Philistines. So going north from Arad through Philistine country was just out of the question. Why then didn't they just go ahead and go through Edom? There's absolutely no doubt the Edomites wouldn't have been able to stop Israel. I wouldn't even begin to venture a guess as to how many Edomites there were at this time. But as a nomadic society, it couldn't have been that many, maybe a few scores of thousands. But how could that ever have matched up to Israel's biblically stated 600,000 man army? It couldn't. Now, this had much more to do with Moses' truthful plea to the king of Edom, calling them brother. Moses, and apparently the Lord, didn't want the Israelites to annihilate Edom. Jehovah did not want the descendants of Jacob killing the descendants of his twin brother Esau. So after defeating the king of Arad's forces, Moses led the Israelites south towards the Gulf of Aqaba, which achieved the purpose of skirting the territory of Edom and avoiding the conflict with them. This involved a journey of about 90 miles south, then about 15 miles east before they then turned north again. This must have really chafed at the people of Israel. I mean, let me tell you, this is some really serious, bad desert territory they were marching through. Unpleasant, just is the least you could say about it. I mean, it must have felt like they were backtracking at least a month's worth of travel. So, as it says at the end of verse 4 and the beginning of verse 5, the people grew restive on their journey and they spoke against God and against Moses. Oh, yeah. Well, we're going to leave it here for today. And we're going to see what God does about this latest rebellion next week. Please rise.